Hey guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I am bringing you my January wrap-up. January was interesting because while I read a lot in January, I read 11 books, I didn't really read anything that totally blew me away. Usually, I have a very, very clear favorite book of the month, and that just did not happen in January. Everything I read was okay. The real winners here were nonfiction, because I actually read 3 nonfiction books, which is very unusual for me because I tend to stick to fiction pretty heavily. But the things that I did really love were the nonfiction books, although there were some things that I did enjoy from sort of the fiction side, what I typically tend to read. But yeah, it was a bit of a weird one. I guess maybe it was just kind of like kicking myself out of the slump from December, because I did go into a little bit of a reading slump. You know, lockdown and everything has been getting to me a little bit, and it was definitely affecting my reading. But yeah, I had the chance to kickstart my reading again, which was great. But it was definitely it feels like an unusual month. You'll see what I mean. I am keeping track of my TBR, as I mentioned. It is one of my big goals for this year. I really want to read down my TBR, even by like 1 book at the end of the year. If it's slightly lower, I will be very happy. So when I did my TBR video, which I will link above so you can check it out, I confessed that my TBR was sitting at 822 books. I did a little recount, and it's actually now sitting at 826. So I did go up a little bit. I'll talk about the books that I picked up in January in my book haul, but all of those are kind of counted now. 826. We're not doing great here, but I'm just doing my best. So in January, I listened to 2 audiobooks, and I read 4 review copies, and actually I also binge read a series, which, if you know me, you know that I am not much of a series reader, not for any reason other than I just get really distracted really easily. So one of my big goals for this year is to actually, in addition to reading down my TBR, is to read through a lot of the series that I have started and then abandoned for no real reason at all. But I did manage to binge a series, which was a very interesting experience. But yeah, it was a weird month. It was just a little bit unusual. So usually what I do is I take you through everything that I read in order, but I don't think I'm going to do that this time. I'm going to kind of like group things together. That makes sense. So speaking of series, that series that I did binge read in January is the Realm of the Graceling series by Kristen Kishore. So we start with Graceling here, which was actually a reread for me. I read this back in it must be like 2012 or so, when I had a really boring desk job and my boss used to just kind of let me read on my computer. She knew what was going on. She did not care. She was amazing. And I was really kind of bitter that the other books were not kind of direct continuations of Katza and Poe's story. They were companion novels, or at least a prequel and then kind of a companion novel. So I just never bothered to read the rest of them, which I think is kind of a shame. But the reason that this series came back on my radar is because of Winterkeep, which is the 4th book in the series, which just came out in January. It's a brand new release, and it has, I think there's like an 8-year gap in between the publication of Bitter Blue, which is the 3rd book, and Winterkeep, which is the 4th. So it was a really interesting study in how an author's writing style can change in between these long gaps, and how their characters and kind of stories and stuff change. So this overall, I think, was a solid like 3.5 star series experience. But yeah, I'll run through the individual books now. So first up is Graceling, of course the very first book in this series. In this particular world, there are people who are bestowed with a grace, which is basically a exceptional skill. And usually it's something really mundane, like someone can be graced with like tree climbing or with swimming really well or being able to hold their breath underwater. But there are more sort of useful and important graces. So there are people who are graced with sort of hand-to-hand combat, or with sword fighting, or with incredible strength. Our main character, Katza, is graced with murder. She is incredibly strong, incredibly fast, and she's absolutely deadly, and she is used by her uncle as a way to kind of like keep the lords in line, because she's this incredibly feared figure, and she absolutely hates it. And this has kind of warped her in a way, because she feels incredibly cut off and alone. However, she doesn't really have the skills to sort of soften and make friends. She's sort of like takes what she can get in terms of friendship, and she ends up kind of, I don't want to give away too much, but she ends up kind of tumbling into this unusual situation and gets kind of tied into the politics of other kingdoms. I really enjoyed this. This is my favorite in the series. I think it's just like, it was so sort of different for its time, because I think this is an older YA book, and it does show its age in many ways. So it was published in 2008, at least here in the UK, and it's got a lot of those tropes that we now think of as being super, super familiar and kind of like lame, but they were sort of more fresh for their time. So like, Katza's so not like other girls. And you know, she doesn't wear her dresses, and she wants to cut off all of her hair, and she's just so different and so put upon, and it's like, okay, Katza. But we also have a lot of really interesting stuff that we don't see very often in YA novels. This book is all about consent and another person's kind of control over you, whether it's through magical means or through sort of social norms like marriage. Katza refuses to marry. She does not want to have children. This is very unusual, and I really, really enjoyed that. So this was a really fun thing to reread, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then we have Fire, which is the prequel to Graceling, but is absolutely necessary if you want to continue on with the series. This takes place about 50 to 60 years before the events of Graceling, and we follow a character named Fire who lives in a sort of neighboring region called the Dells. They don't have Gracelings in the Dells, instead they have monsters, which are these kind of otherworldly, beautiful sort of versions of creatures. So think like shiny Pokemon. They're like the shiny Pokemon of this world. And you can have human monsters, and Fire is indeed one of these human monsters. She is incredibly, stunningly beautiful to the point where like hypnotizes people regardless of their sexual attraction, and her hair is this kind of incredible iridescent thing that's super, super alluring both to other humans and to other monsters who want to kill her and feed on her, because that's what monsters do. So she ends up getting tangled up in the politics of her land, and I really, really enjoyed a lot of this, but the stuff that I did not like, I really, really hated. This book is a little bit rough in terms of things like sexual assault, because if you are a stunningly beautiful woman, where if a man lays his eyes on you, he cannot control himself, obviously we're going to get into some sticky situations, and that was a little bit rough to read. There's no rape in this book, but they do talk about rape in this book, and there's a lot of like her just flat out being assaulted, whether it's people wanting to like have sex with her or kill her. And there are some characters that I really loved. I loved Fire, which I think is kind of an unpopular opinion. People do not like her. She is very much the opposite of Katza. She is not the kind of like physically strong female character. She's someone who really, really comes into her own throughout the story, and I really loved that. There is a love interest called Archer who I would like to fall off of a cliff. He is awful and I hate him, but he does serve a really interesting purpose in the story. There's a lot of kind of conflict for me in this book, but overall I gave it, I think, 3.5 out of 5 stars. The bits I loved, I loved. The bits that I hated, I think were really, really rough. Then we have Bitter Blue, which is the 3rd book in this series, and this takes place, I think, like 6 years after the events of Graceling, and it ties those first 2 books together really well. I don't really want to talk about what this one is about because it is sort of directly related to the events of the first book, but this is all about healing and trauma, whether on an individual level or a national level. There's a lot to really like about this book, but it's a weird one because it is very intentionally weird and bizarre and really hard to kind of like get a grip on what's going on, but that's because the characters are also feeling like that, so it made for kind of a trippy experience. I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. And then last but not least, we have Winterkeep. So this is the new book, and it takes us, I think, 5 years after the events of Bitterblue. And in this, we follow Bitterblue as she travels to this marvelous new land called Winterkeep that has been recently discovered across the sea. And it's all about kind of like politics and diplomacy in that sense. But also we are introduced to a whole new area that also does not have Gracelings. It has sort of these marvelous creatures, sort of telepathic seals who are storytellers, which is great. We have telepathic foxes that bond to people and kind of like partner with them. And we follow a girl named Lovisa, who is a native of this land, and she is the daughter of two major politicians, and she ends up sort of uncovering some shenanigans. It was fine. I think it was really interesting to read this back to back with Bitterblue because, as I said, there is such a huge gap between the publication years. It was fine. I think that it's kind of verging into adult fantasy territory, which the books in the series do tend to be quite adult, but they're very firmly YA. And I was talking to my friend, oops, I dropped a book. I was talking to my friend Josie about this, and she made a really good point that this book didn't really know who it was marketing itself to. Is it an adult book? Is it a YA book? It was really kind of unclear, and I think that that sort of muddled things a little bit. But overall, it was fun. If you like the Graceling books, you should absolutely give it a try. I don't think that it like knocked it out of the park. It's definitely among the books where we have YA authors revisiting old series and writing new books in those series for probably lots and lots of money, which is totally fair enough. I thought that it worked, but I feel like this is kind of a new era. It's not really part of the original series in a way, if that makes any sense. I don't know. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. Okay, so kind of going in a different direction here, we have The Dogs of War by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is an adult science fiction novel that takes place in the near future, and it follows a bunch of different characters, but they all sort of center around this character named Rex, who is a bioform. They're basically a genetically engineered and manipulated sort of new creature taken from the DNA of dogs and sort of has the instincts of dogs, but is also a fighting and killing machine used by the military. This book is really interesting, especially because of Rex's perspective, which I think dominates the book. So at the very beginning, he is very much like, imagine seeing the world through your dog's eyes, except your dog is a killing machine that's like going after anarchists. And he has like a feedback chip that tells him he's a good dog when he goes and he kills these enemies. He's communicating with the rest of his team who are also bioforms. We have Dragon, who's kind of like an iguana chameleon type character. We have Bees, which is a swarm of bees, and we have Honey, who is a bear and who is absolutely amazing. And so they go through all these kind of military operations, and as the book progresses, there's a thing that happens, and as the book progresses, Rex begins to learn a little bit more about himself and about sort of his humanity. So this book is all about ethics, which is really interesting, scientific ethics and military ethics, and it's absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed this one. This is definitely one of my favorites of the month. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and the sequel, which is Bearhead, which I keep talking about, it's on my TBR, just came out in January, so I'm going to be picking that up very soon. So then I have a few review copies. They're all young adult, which is interesting. One of them is a book of stories, one is a YA thriller, and the other is a graphic novel. So to talk about the graphic novel first, we have The Sad Ghost Club by Liz Meddings. This is a very sweet and quite short graphic novel, and I believe The Sad Ghost Club has a little bit of a following online, so it may be something that you have heard of. But this just came out in January, and it is very sweet. It basically follows a day in the life of this main character, who obviously has anxiety and depression and is really, really sort of nervous and doesn't have a lot of friends and gets invited to a party and sort of agonizes over whether or not they're going to go to this party. They end up going and they make a friend. It's really lovely. If you're looking for plot, that's not what you're gonna get here. However, if you're just looking for something really sweet that talks about mental health and something that I think teenagers would find a really, really valuable resource, I think that this is kind of the perfect thing. It is just absolutely lovely. You can read it in like half an hour, and I really, really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then we have Tales from the Hinterland by Melissa Albert. I very, very much did not enjoy the Hazelwood duology, which this is sort of based on, so you may be wondering why I bothered to request it. The reason that I did is because I came out of the Hazelwood wanting this. So the Hazelwood is a duology that follows a girl whose grandmother is this sort of cult writer, and she has this book called Tales of the Hinterland, which are very, very, very dark fairy tales, and she ends up going to her grandmother's house after her grandmother passes away, finds out that everything is very much real. I came out of that book wanting this. I wanted Tales from the Hinterland. I wanted to read these stories. I wanted these fairy tales, and I have to say that she very much delivered with this book. So there are some standouts here. I think there are like 12 stories in here, and some of these will sound familiar if you've read the Hazelwood books. So some of my favorites were The Clockwork Bride, The Skinned Maiden, which is very dark, Alice 3 Times, which is one of the big ones from the Hazelwood, and I really liked Twice Killed Catherine, which is another one that you may recognize if you've read those books. I thought that these were just really great. It's a short little volume. It's not very long. They're all like, I don't know, 20 pages, maybe 30 pages, and it was a really, really great thing to read. I love dark fairy tales. If you're looking for happy endings, depending on what your definition of a happy ending will be, this may or may not be the thing for you, but I really, really, really enjoyed this. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Some of them I thought were a little bit more dull than others, but again, this is kind of what I wanted out of that original series. And the last of the review copies is Lock the Doors by Vincent Ralph. This is a YA thriller, and I love YA thrillers. There's something about them that I just absolutely adore. However, this one didn't quite hit the mark for me. So in this book, we have a character named Tom, and Tom's family has just moved into a new house. It's his mother's dream house, and everyone is very happy except for Tom, who begins to realize that there are some strange things about this house that everyone else is ignoring. Namely, there are sort of holes on the outside of the bedroom doors showing where locks were. So the people in these rooms were locked in and they could not get out. So that's kind of the thing that sparks his interest in the history of this house, and he soon learns that the family who lived in this house before them, that they bought the house from, now live across the street. So he ends up befriending the daughter, and he sort of wants to be her friend, and he wants to sort of make friends, and she's a really interesting person. He really likes her, but he's also obsessed with finding out what happened in this house, if anything. So ultimately I enjoyed this book, but it did take a little while for me to get there. These are incredibly short chapters. Like, that is a chapter. And I know that that is something that a lot of people do tend to really enjoy. They like short chapters. I don't really. I prefer longer chapters, and so that broke it up in such a way that it almost felt like I didn't feel the need to keep going. I could just put it down because a chapter was ending, like on the next page. I also didn't, I understand where his sort of obsession comes from, and I understand sort of his actions. He is a character with OCD. I absolutely cannot attest to how good the representation is in this book, but I understand where a lot of his obsessive sort of traits come from because of this OCD, and also because of his own past. But I felt like, for me, what I want is something like Karen M. McManus's books, where it feels realistic that these teenagers would be doing this thing and solving this crime. In this, it felt like he should have gone to the cops, like 50 pages in. And I really struggled with that because as someone who is really interested in kind of criminal procedure and things like that and investigation, I'm like, you're screwing everything up, stop it. So I really struggled with that aspect of the book. However, ultimately, sort of what was going on, I found really satisfying and really interesting. So I think this is going to be hit or miss for some people. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Oh, and really quickly, big content warning for domestic abuse in this. His mother is formerly a battered woman. She went through a series of really horrible relationships, and it is very much described on the page. So if you're not comfortable with sort of descriptions and on-page domestic violence, and sort of like threatening situations and things like that, I would give this a miss because it's very present. So now I have my nonfiction books. So the first one I listened to on audio, although I had a copy on my shelf. I've had this for ages. I have been meaning to read it for ages because it is such a well-known book within its genre. I just never got around to it until now. I read The Stranger Beside Me by Ann Rule. This is her true crime book following the life and crimes of Ted Bundy, who is of course a famous American serial killer. The twist on this being that she knew him, she was friends with him. And what I was kind of unclear on before I started this is I thought that she was an acquaintance of his, because whenever people describe this book, they're like, oh, they worked together on the Samaritan's hotline, you know, she was a volunteer, he was working, and they knew each other through that. But they were like really good friends, like really like decades-long friends by the time he was put on trial and executed for his crimes. So her insight is really interesting, and I think something that people tend to struggle with is, how did you not know? How did this person not know? How did she not know that her husband was doing all these horrible things? I think that she gives great perspective on that because she is a smart woman. She was literally writing true crime articles when she was friends with this guy. She did, I think, call him in on a tip line, but that was about it. And she knew that there was a guy going around killing women whose name was Ted and drove the same car as him and looked just like him, but she still wasn't sure because her friend could never do that, but of course he could, and he did. I would say if you are sort of sensitive to some of the outdated language that can be used in some of these books, I mean, this was written in, what, the 80s? And it shows in some ways, yeah, 1980s. So if you are not comfortable with some very dated language, particularly around disabled people and around sexual assault and stuff, I would maybe steer clear, but that is something I would keep in mind if you are choosing to read this. Also, there are pretty graphic descriptions of the things that he did, especially toward the end of his crime spree, that are really uncomfortable. So just as a heads up, if you're not really a true crime person, maybe not the thing for you, but if you've not read this yet and you are interested in true crime and sort of like serial killers in the mind of a killer and all of that, I would definitely recommend this. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. This is one of the standout books of the month. The next nonfiction book that I read was also an audiobook. This is Billion Dollar Loser, The Epic Rise and Fall of WeWork. This is by Reeves Widerman. So, business books, not my thing. I couldn't be less interested in business. Like, oh my god, absolutely not. But the reason that I picked this up is because there's a really fantastic podcast called We Crashed. I think it's a Wondery one, who do a lot of very well-known podcasts, like they did the Tiger King and Dirty John and all of that. And it basically tracks how this company got started and how it sort of like skyrocketed to the top and then just fell apart, and it's fascinating. It's really interesting. If you're someone like me who's really interested in cults and cult leaders and learning about that, it's got a lot of those aspects. So I listened to We Crash last year, and I really loved it. And I found out that this book had come out because my sister got it for my dad for Christmas, and we were all kind of queuing up to read it, and I just decided to get it on audio, and it was great. I really enjoyed it. The man, Adam Newman, who started this company, is such an interesting and completely and totally insufferable person. I would hate to know him in real life. He sounds awful. But it's really interesting to see what his kind of public persona was versus what was really going on. He had no idea what he was doing. This whole company just completely and totally crashed after being valued as, you know, this huge mega startup, and it's really fascinating. This is not going to interest a lot of you guys, but I found it really interesting and I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. And last but not least, I read Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. This is a graphic novel adaptation of his very famous nonfiction book called Sapiens, and it's basically a history of mankind through the present day. He is a historian, but he believes that you cannot understand history without understanding human history. And this is really interesting, and also kind of an interesting way of presenting all of this information. It is very much kind of like cutesy in a lot of ways. So like there's a magic show and there's like a comic book that runs through this, and you know, there's all of this kind of like cutesy stuff that goes on. There's like a superhero, and it's very much presented in a way for like you would imagine for children to understand, but the actual like words that he uses and the concepts are quite, I found, complicated. I found myself going through this very slowly. I know I didn't retain all of it, like please. But I don't think that despite the way that it's presented, this is necessarily something that young kids will enjoy. I think it'll fly right over their heads. So I would say like teenage and higher, this would be good for. But it's kind of a weird one because it is presented in like that really cutesy kind of way. So let's see if I can get an example. Okay, so throughout a lot of this book, a lot of it is presented as him kind of explaining concepts to his niece who's coming to visit, and his niece sort of features throughout the book as kind of like the everyday person trying to understand what all of this is. But at some point, like, this like superhero for like fiction and like fictional stories, because part of the cognitive revolution for mankind was the ability to create fictions, which means that they could create culture and religions, and that's how we ended up building up to what we are now. But it's so like kind of silly, but at the same time, like, this is some real deep shit we're getting into here. So it's funny. It's like, it's sort of a juxtaposition in terms of how it's presented versus what the actual content is. So yeah, it's an interesting one because in a way it's like for children, but it's not for children. It's for adults, but it's not for adults. I don't know. It's a weird one. I would be really curious to hear if you have read this. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I know that there is, I think, another volume coming because I don't think this covers everything, and it also has like a little, you know, coming soon thing. So I'd be very curious to see what other people think of this. I know that his book is very well respected and really sort of like widely praised. So I don't know, it was a really interesting concept. I would love to read more nonfiction graphic novels. If you have any recommendations, let me know. So yeah, that is what I read in the month of January. It was a little bit of a weirder month for me, as I said. There was still like fantasy in here and sci-fi in here, but a lot of the stuff that I really loved and stuck with me were those nonfiction audiobooks. So I would love to hear in the comments below if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them. If you have recommendations for nonfiction graphic novels, I would love to hear them. And also I'd love to hear what you read in the month of January. I post bookish content to this channel fairly frequently, so go ahead and hit subscribe, check back soon, and I will see you next time.